Next speaker, Mr. Will Nichols. Will's professional background covers so much. He's a water resources engineer with Intera, has expertise in the areas of hydrology, environmental site characterization, phase and transport modeling, pathway and exposure modeling, uncertainty and sensitivity analysis, integrated risk assessment, probabilistic modeling, and simulation and software quality assurance. He has applied his expertise in all these areas to help solve problems of national importance, such as Yucca and also, Hanford remediation projects that are conducted under RCRA, Circular, Nuclear Waste Act, NEPA, and all that. And Will's expertise has been applied in support of environmental restoration, dose reconstruction for legacy waste practices, and a demonstration of compliance with applicable waste disposal regulatory requirements. He has successfully led big teams, multidisciplinary teams, in software development efforts and scientific studies to deliver high-impact products, including scientific simulators used to evaluate environmental dose and the TSPA. Will's NEPA experience includes contributing to long-term consequence portions of environmental impact statements for nationally important facilities.
I'm going to give a status. I've been asked to provide quarterly status reports to the LFROG, and this one takes the form of presenting here today with you on the effort to update the Hanford site composite analysis. So I'm going to go over a little bit about that project, the work we completed in FY 2018, and what we're planning to do this year. Our general project schedule, we reached a determination in the annual status report for the composite analysis maintenance in 2015 that it needed to be updated. We did some early planning work. We're under direction from headquarters at Hanford that our modeling work has to follow a phased approach of planning and scoping and then analysis, and there are checkpoints to move between those phases. The big checkpoint was in 2017 when we got our scoping phase concluded by preparing our proposed technical approach, which we took to the Hanford Groundwater Vado Zone Executive Council for approval to move into the analysis phase, which we're now in. My schedule keeps extending to the right with each funding reduction. It's strange how that happens. Many of you, I'm sure, have experienced the same thing, and this has been no exception. So 18 had some scale down as we had to focus our work with the funding that we had. Now, about the scale of this analysis, it's big. The CA for Hanford is focused on the central plateau where all the chemical separation facilities were located that operated from the middle of the Second World War to the end of the 1980s to produce plutonium, a good deal of it. The cleanup in this area is proceeding under what's colloquially known as the Tri-Party Agreement, a handful federal consent decree under CERCLA, RCRA, and AEA authority. The TPA is specifically implementing the CERCLA and the RCRA components of that. Now, some complexities to this particular composite analysis. We have a very deep vado zone. It's on the order of 100 meters throughout the central plateau. It's a significant feature. You just heard Pat talk about how long it takes for even unretarded species to reach the water table under the IDF when you have dry conditions. That 100 meters is a lot. The flood deposition setting for the geology is very interesting. Someone asked about paleo record. We don't know. That soil's not there anymore. 10,000 years ago, the Great Missoula floods in the last ice age ripped through this area repeatedly, laid down new deposits of material carried out of Montana and God knows where else under energy gradients. And so you're looking at a geology that is all massive cataclysmic flood laydown. So looking to paleo doesn't tell you much. The soils aren't that old. The site, because of its history and the massive effluent discharges during the operational period, we have extensive overlapping groundwater plumes today in the unconfined aquifer. It is a very dynamic environment during that period hydraulically because the amount of water brought up for these chemical separation facilities completely dwarfed any natural recharge signal. We just heard about 3.5. That's kind of the signal of 3.5 millimeters a year, how much water is passing through native soils with full vegetation cover. But now you bring in a lot of water, you discharge it to ground. There's a lot of forcing factors, therefore, and you see the kind of plumes that are shown here. Another complication is we're trying to project post-closure status for the Hanford facility. We don't know all the end states yet. There are a lot of decisions in process, or to-go decisions under RCRA and CERCLA. Another factor is that we have hundreds, that's actually understatement, we have thousands of waste sites that are identified in our waste information database system at Hanford. Hundreds of them are significant when you do a study like this, and they're in close proximity. And a lot of them were effluent discharge sites where there's a strong potential for commingling, and that's important. And then we have remedial actions that we need to account for. For example, massive pump and treat systems for treatment of groundwater, treating literally billions with a B gallons of water a year. That's a big perturbation on a system. And we want to account for all of this. To do so, I heard model components, I think was Pat's term. We've called them facets. You have to organize your modeling in some fashion. So we've adopted the term facets for the discrete modeling work elements that we can identify and work independently by defining the interfaces that they're going to share. And so for this analysis and inventory, that is an inventory globally of the Hanford site that we need to simulate. How that will release for the solid forms, and that's not a nice single salt cake or a piece of glass now. Now we're talking about soil debris models. What is the dissolution rate for a contaminated buried Jeep? It might be different than something. It's going to be very much rough order of magnitude kind of things when you're dealing with such diversity of sites. A Vado zone fate and transport, of course, for the big feature I mentioned. Groundwater fate and transport facet for our unconfined aquifer. We're revisiting the atmospheric dose that was calculated in the initial CA. By the way, that initial CA was done in 1998. It's a little old now. That's one of the reasons for the update that's needed. And the dose calculation, of course, and then we need something to tie all of these pieces together, which we've identified as an integrated computational framework. Now, to prepare for conducting this analysis, we laid out, as I said, a document that for the Groundwater Vado Zone Executive Council that said this is the proposed technical approach that we're adopting after we did a scoping process. And that document we in turn supported with a technical approach description for each facet. So those documents are all the ones I've listed here by the facets. All of them, by the way, interestingly enough, while CERCLA and RCRA work at Hanford, we have an administrative record to tuck all our documents into. They need to support a particular, say, CERCLA OU operable unit. There's not a place for a pure 435 product to go into that AR. It didn't fit. Deeb's nodding. He knows what I'm talking about. What we settled on is OSTI. So now for these pure 435 products, we are parking all of our documentation in OSTI as we proceed. At the end of this presentation, there are hyperlinks to all of those that I'm mentioning. That's been a good solution, I think, to make all of these as available as possible to LFROG and others. So the high-level wiring diagram, of course, gets busy on something like this. We're listing the kinds of data sources down the left side in the yellow boxes that we need to integrate into the modeling framework. Our facets are the blue boxes with green above them, indicating the kind of software that we're implementing that aspect in. And then the whole concept of an integrated computational framework with an automated quality control layer to handle as much quality checking as we can in an automated fashion before things enter into a data layer that can move back and forth between the facet component or components of the model, and a GIS interface to begin at the end to allow you to interrogate what the feeds are between the facets and the final results. A key piece, is the razor pointer at least right? A key piece here is part of our tech approach is we're not remodeling anything that has a performance assessment. Those will be imported directly into the composite analysis, so PATS releases that he just talked about, for example, will be imported in total and put right into the CA without the need to remodel it. So some of the work, because I said we had a funding reduction, I focused our resources last year in FY 2018 on 3 facets, which was to get our inventory completed, the assembly of our total inventory, to begin the development of our waste form release component or facet, and to make substantial progress on our Vado zone modeling. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those facets and what we got done. For the inventory facet, a big achievement was the update of the Hanford soil inventory model. In the original composite analysis, there were many past practice units that had no inventory. We had no measurements or indication of what to put in there. And the LFROG said, yes, but you've got process knowledge that you could use to begin to estimate that. And that was the genesis of the SIM V1, the Soil Inventory Model version 1, in which models all of the tank mixing and exchanges by campaign throughout the operational history, using all those records of the chemical engineering that went on to begin to say, okay, here would be the concentration at the time of an event that leaked it into the environment, say a tank overflow event or whatever. So the SIM is doing that. It's handling all of those campaigns and exchanges and mixing and coming up with estimates of volumes and concentrations of all the liquid past practice discharge units to simulate. So we've updated that model where sometimes you discover neat things like when you're doing stochastic, it doesn't necessarily have to be Monte Carlo. The original SIM V1 was a Monte Carlo-based model that used like 50,000 realizations, which would take some computer power. But it turns out you could solve all of the statistics analytically, which means direct solution and no need for all of that iteration. And we've done that in SIM V2. It's much faster. It's more accurate on the tails. So that's been one of the things we did in the update, as well as updating a lot of information on the inputs that help to correct some known problems in SIM V1. In our QA parlance, we develop a model package report to document the construction and the basis of a model. And then when we apply the model, we produce an environmental calculation file that documents that specific application. So that's what we've done here. We have a model package report for the SIM V2. And our first application was to get the radionuclide inventories that we need for the composite analysis done. That's the ECF Hanford 1779. And that fed into our data package now that we're completing right now. This document won't be in OSTI yet because it's not quite done through the review. So we have all of those liquid inventories coming from the SIM plus estimates of all the solid sites. We do not have the chemical run with SIM yet. That's yet to come in the coming year for another analysis. We also finished looking in our technical approach we adopted for which RADs we need to run for this composite analysis for the groundwater pathway. Rather than doing yet another in a long history of Hanford screening analyses on this, we pledged to look at all of the existing work to date. So for example, we start with the RADs that the Tank Closure and Waste Management EIS chose in their screening analysis to model. We looked at the results of that EIS and took out those RADs that actually didn't emerge. You know, they were in the screening analysis, but they never got anywhere. So we reduced the list. Then we add back in those that were in the original composite analysis that for some reason the EIS didn't need to look at. And added in anything for the groundwater pathway of the PAs that the CA will support that was not already on the list. So the final list we came up with is in these 2 groups that we'll simulate shown here. And there's a document that'll be out very soon also shown here for that. For the waste form release facet, we got started on this to implement in GoldSim the release models that were recommended in this particular facet's technical approach description. And that got done, plus we have been working closely with the WMAC PA team to bring their grouted tank model into our system and generalize it for representation of all the remaining tank farms. Now, of course, we don't need to remodel the C farm PA. We have those results. But there are 10 other waste management areas with tanks yet to go. We've got to do something to represent those. So we're generalizing the model to handle that. And in that process, we're doing some work with this new release model that's implemented in GoldSim. We're doing some comparison of the grouted tank model to the original PA model. We're testing different discretization schemes, comparing to the original CA model, which was called the salt tank model. It's good to be able to describe how this will change what we simulated in the 98 CA, and then some sensitivity analysis on the key parameters. The comparison, for example, of the salt cake model used in the 98 CA and the grouted tank CA model here shown for the uranium 238 release rates. And we see that it is substantially reducing the conservatism, if you will, or the overstatement of the release by adopting the new work done in the CFARM PA. Similarly for the release rate of the Tech 99, which again will be a big dose driver. We already know from EIS and other analyses that just like here at Savannah River, it's going to be Tech and iodine for at least the next 1,000, maybe 10,000 years to be the dose driver. Uranium takes over later on. Sensitivity analysis looked at the list of parameters shown here on the left, varying them in a classic sensitivity analysis. This is a quick just to look at what this what is affecting, sort of begin to get at what parameters do we need to play with later on. And clearly the one that pops out here is the effective diffusion coefficient. The red and blue lines have the most divergence from one another, which is good information. We're by no means done with the grouted tank model. We've got some issues that in our review we found with boundary condition on that. We need to do more work to get it closer to what the CFARM representation was. Moving on to the Vado zone facet, here's where the bulk of the work is because of the importance of this feature and the commingling concern. So we're developing a series of about 24 three-dimensional models implemented in STOMP. These models, roughly 1 million nodes apiece. The reason for the size is because we've convinced ourselves with enough modeling studies that the commingling for all the past effluent discharge facilities matters. Remember, in the unsaturated zone, as you add liquid, you saturate a soil more, you increase the conductivity of that soil, hence a faster pathway. So if you model single effluent discharges separately, you're going to get a different answer than if you recognize that you're wetting features together and transporting through it. And we've demonstrated that for several complexes. So we've reached this realization that we really cannot model a waste site at a time when they're in close proximity and involve effluent discharge. So we have been picking these boundaries carefully based on evaluation of those effluent discharge volumes and proximity to get the set of models that we need. This one in particular is in the B complex area. We're being careful to align the models to the groundwater model underneath. So you see the yellow cells in this, the faint yellow ones are the underlying groundwater domain grid. The red is the boundary of this particular Vado zone model. Features are shown are tanks and cribs and trenches in the purple, the kinds of waste sites. The green boundary is an important feature that this particular Vado zone model has to capture, which is a silting layer that creates a perched aquifer within the Vado zone. It's got a lot of uranium in it. It's a very substantial feature and one that it would be hard to capture with a simpler model or by ignoring or trying to teach each waste site one at a time. An important feature that we put together the year before that is now supporting us is we built the item mentioned on the right, a geologic framework. It was developed with both Kingdom and Leapfrog software of the entire Central Plateau Vado zone. This is to give us a solid geologic representation to base our models on to support an equivalent homogeneous model construct for all of these different 24 Vado zone models that will be coherent. Where models need to overlap, the geology will always agree because they're always coming from the same three-dimensional geologic representation. So the first ever 3D Vado zone geoframework construction done to support this is an example, I think, of the importance of the investment that WOE is making in this CA because it's paying dividends with resources that the rest of the site can use for other work, circular and otherwise. This geoframework being one example, SIM being another one. In this case, here's the B complex model, and you're seeing the perched aquifer there towards the bottom represented. It's held up by a Cold Creek silted lens unit here in which water can perch above the aquifer. and slowly leach out the uranium content that's there. The three-dimensional look at that silt lens. Another tool that we're developing to support this is the recognition, 3.5 is a nice average if everything is vegetated, 3.5 millimeters a year, and everything has the same soil type. But in truth, recharge will depend on both soil type and vegetative cover, which changes in time. So we are developing a new GIS-based tool, the recharge estimate tool, to provide site-specific information that's both spatial and temporally variable, to recognize changes in surface conditions over time in the modeling. And it will use the representation of the waste sites, the soil classifications, and the history of documented actions and projected actions under a disposition baseline for how the surface will change in time. So it begins, for instance, this is a look in 1943 before anything begins, before you scrape any of the surface off, and you see a little bit of variability, and this is in the is this the B complex area? I think so. So you see a variability here only represents changes in soil type. It's shown there's an Ephrata sandy loam, Burbank loamy sand, Rupert sand, and those have different recharge rates that are based on lysimetry and chloride tracer and other measurements that PNNL has done for years. But as we change the conditions during operations, you begin to remove surface, you begin to have areas that are operational and maintained vegetative free with gravel. You can see that the recharge then ranges all the way up to 92 millimeters per year if you're under a disturbed gravel and spraying herbicide all the time, which is kind of how operational areas work. So capturing that into the model from 3.5 to 92 is pretty important. Here we move to 1994, conditions changing again. And that tool then is giving us the means to represent a little more fidelity the variation of recharge, which is such an important force, especially going into the future, post-artificial recharge. As I said, we're committed to capturing and representing the performance assessment results directly, not remodeling them. We have a QA plan for this project that amplifies and augments the QA we're already under for modeling at the complex. And among these is that we're going to use a data readiness review in which we check all of the inputs that are being prepared for the composite analysis. All of those are documented in an electronic model data transmittal form, which is a cover sheet to identify who gathered the data, where it came from, give some characterization of the quality, recognizing that you've got to collect a lot of information of very disparate levels of quality. Information from the past, when you just simply can't go out and collect new records from the 1950s, is still important, whatever the veracity of the source. So you've got to just characterize what you're dealing with. We have captured, under this process, our feeds from the Environmental Restoration Disposal Facility PA, WMAC PA, and the IDF PA. Those are the more modern ones in which all the modeling records are captured in our QA system and relatively easy to access. We went back and looked hard at the two PAs that we still maintain for the 200 West low-level burial grounds and the 200 East low-level burial grounds, and there's no model files to be found. And there's no results shown in the PA that will let us represent what we need to represent in the CA. So we've got a challenge with that. There's already a finding from EA that we need to redo those PAs. These were written in 95 and 96. They're kind of old. And so we actually are starting a new PA at Hanford, I think in January, for the active low-level burial grounds to update that. And we'll get to the ones that are no longer active later. And then U.S. Ecology has a commercial disposal facility at Hanford as well. They have an environmental impact statement, and we've captured their model results for inclusion. So what's ahead? We're going to complete the wasteform model documentation and the support application I talked about. We're going to get the Vedo zone models, because of their complexity, have gone through a 3-phase development. We had a pilot for about 6 of them. Then we took all of them to a preliminary stage, and now we're embarked in making them final, which is to give them all of the input streams and to provide all of the QA and checking and verification and documentation. That's going to get done this year. We're going to complete our confirmatory atmospheric calculation for that pathway. to substantiate what the 98 CA had on that. We're going to upgrade our Plateau to river groundwater model to support the composite analysis. That will include increased resolution and a more robust calibration. We'll develop our dose calculation that's fully documented in the technical approach description for that into a Gold Sim framework this year. And we're supporting acquisition of a new computer system to run all of this stuff. We hope to get the CA calculations first pass done by a year from December and provide a decisional draft sometime in 2020, funding permitting. And I'll take any questions if Ming says there's time.
Yes, there are. Thank you, Will. I think we have time for a couple questions.
Andy.
Yes, Andy.
Yeah, so in your flow and transport facets of your wire diagram, you showed 3 different models. You showed STOMP, ModFlow, and MT3DMS.
Yes.
Why do you need 3 different models?
Well, remember, it's 24 STOMP models for the Vado zone. It's 1 regional groundwater model, and the flow and transport are separated in ModFlow. But the real answer to your question, Andy, is that at Hanford I was under direction to use those codes.
Okay.
I didn't pick them. They're picked for us back in 2006 by direction from headquarters with a thou shalt use these. I would have a hard justification to get away from them.
Are these codes required to be NQA1 certified
We have done that.
for all 3?
Yes. Yeah, we have all that under my QA system.
Thanks.
Yeah, I have a question about your assumption about the basalt bedrock that's
Yes.
eroded.
Yes.
How do you assume that that's a no-flow boundary with those all those
Did I
erosional?
say that yet?
Well, is
Or are
it?
you
I
assuming
mean,
it is.
are you modeling the basalt bedrock as a no-flow boundary?
I know you did master's work on this, didn't you?
No, I just want to know when you have erosional windows
Yeah.
from the floods. I want to know, and there's a tremendous amount of data from BWEP
Yes.
regarding the
Yes,
borehole
there is.
data, so on and so forth. So I'd just like to know, what are you assuming? And, if you could elaborate on that, I'd appreciate it.
Absolutely. In fact, it is usually used as a no-flow boundary, the basalt on the super basalt aquifer, the unconfined aquifer. We're not exclusively doing that. We are looking at a fractured flow top alternative conceptual model right now and erosional windows. We've got Mark Williams is leading the Vado Zone Facet team. Perhaps you know him, and he developed back in PNNL the ACM3, Alternative Conceptual Model 3, with the old site-wide model that PNNL had that had erosional windows and other features that it looked at. So we're painfully aware of it. Doug Hildebrand is keen for us to look at that, my client at DOE. So no, by no means have we just made a flat assumption of a no flow on the basalt.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if I wasn't sure if I had heard that assumption.
No, I didn't express that assumption here. So, other questions?
Yeah.
Andy wants another one.
This is the final one.
I could do an easy one.
So you mentioned somewhere in one of your slides that you didn't need to do all the simulations because you could do the statistics analytically.
This was for the soil inventory model only, which is the mixing model of all the tank streams and everything. When we looked,
wouldn't you need to make some assumptions about the distribution, the actual distribution itself?
we looked at the assumed distributions, and that was the case, that
Okay.
we could do it analytically.
Okay.
It was a neat discovery that we could cut out all of the useless cycles on a Monte Carlo method when you don't need it and directly solve the statistics. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Will.